Bah humbug. If you cannot tell, or if you can, I'm sick. And, it sucks, but I'm sick. But welcome to BSN 00002. And today we'll be talking about George Orwell's. It's divided into 3 acts, and there are about 10 to 6 chapters between each act. Act 1, I call the beginning of the end. So, with chapter 1, we start out on a cold day in April with our main character, Winston Smith, and he is ascending the steps of Victory Mansions, the place where he lives. And there's a lot of stuff in this chapter that kind of builds the foundation of the world that they live in. First, we learn some physical characteristics about Winston, that he's kind of like meek and mild, kind of a thin white guy, and he has a uniform like all the other members of the party do, of blue overalls. He also has varicose veins right above his right ankle, and he is, I believe, 39. We learn in this chapter. We also learn that he is a member of the party, which is the major faction that we learn of later. But we learn that the major way that they monitor the people of in this city, which is London, is through telescreens and small hidden microphones. We also get a visual of, as Winston is looking over the skyline of the city, of the buildings around him, there's a police copter that patrols the streets and looks inside people's windows, which is like super creepy. And we also learn of the thought police, which are like one of the major antagonists and the people that Winston's most scared of, because you can go to jail and die just because of your thoughts. As Winston is getting to his room, we also learn about the actual city, like I said, which is London, which is the chief city of Airstrip 1, which used to be England and the surrounding area. In Oceania, which is one of the 3 major nation states that we learn of later that exist in this new world, almost alternate universe of our own. We learn that Winston actually works in the Ministry of Truth, which is one of 4 ministries: Ministry of Love, Plenty, Truth, and Peace. On top of the Big Brother posters, they also have a main slogan which is plastered everywhere, which is "War is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength." We see later that a lot of the organization names and the organizational names, but the things that they do are opposite to each other. We learn that they're opposite of each other, especially the slogan. Once Winston gets home, he drinks Victory gin and starts smoking Victory cigarettes. We see that Victory is kind of one of the major establishments that the people of the party use, not the people outside the party. Then he goes into an alcove where he says cannot be monitored by the telescreen, and he starts writing in a journal. This is very important because journals are kind of illegal in this sense, but apparently, as stated by the main character, there are no laws anymore. There are just rules if you broke would lead you to die, essentially lead you to be sentenced to death or execution if you're perceived as being against the party or against the political state. And here we get our first definitive date, April 4th, 1984. But it is noted that he can't really tell exactly what year it is, just only kind of the day. As we learn later, since he works in the Ministry of Truth and the Department of Records, the past gets altered every single day, thousands of times, to the point that we don't know if the past is true or the present is the reality that we actually live in. And there's a lot of philosophical questions about what is the truth and if the past actually exists or not, and who makes up that past. Later on, we get to a presumed daily activity they have to do is 2 minutes of hate, which is essentially they get a bunch of the workers and they all sit around and they have to watch this jarring video that has these harsh sounds and just promotes feelings of anxiety, anger, and frustration towards a singular figure that is called Emmanuel Goldstein, who is the leader of the Brotherhood Party, who is the actual antithesis of the party, or I guess the Brotherhood club almost. It's not a club. Cult, I will say, the Brotherhood cult, and they are the main antagonists of the party themselves. The things of note that also we learned in this first 2 minutes of hate that we see are two characters who become very important later. One, a young girl who is she's younger than Winston, because he's 39. A young woman and a older gentleman. The older gentleman, we know his name is O'Brien. The lady that we figure out her name later, her name is Julia. The reason why Winston recalls this memory of this 2 minutes of hate is because during that 2 minutes of hate, he made eye contact with O'Brien, and in that eye contact, he realized that O'Brien thinks the same that I do. And we learn later that this is kind of like an implied, almost like intuition that Julia, Winston, and people who are against the party kind of have together, because everybody else in the party is so like each other. Anybody who's unlike them, you kind of can infer that they're like you. And this camaraderie inspired Winston to actually buy the notebook. And in this notebook, he writes all of his negative emotions that he has about the party which is known as thought crime. We'll get into what thought crime is. It's a singular word, thought crime. Thought crime. And thought crime is a word from the Newspeak language, which we learn is very important because it's like the new standard language that they're actually trying to create the party themselves. Act 1, Chapter 2. This whole chapter is basically a scene where Miss Parsons, his neighbor, has to knock on his door and ask to have him help her fix her pipes in her house. She lives in the Victory Mansions as well, like in their apartment almost. She says that Tom isn't there at the moment, Tom Parsons, which is her husband, who also works in the Ministry of Truth and we also learn here another thing of everybody gets addressed as comrade instead of friend, neighbor, or anything. It's a more unifying word to use of just comrade. Not much happens in this scene except for Winston himself actually getting accosted by her children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, who are, like how we would in our regular childhood, they start calling him names, but their names are calling him traitor, enemy of the state, a Eurasian spy, and then they start to pretend to shoot him and call him a criminal. It's like a pseudo-traumatic scene for Winston because he's like, I am a criminal. And the boy even shoots a model rocket at his head, at the back of Winston's head. Act 1, Chapter 3. This chapter starts out with Winston dreaming of his mother. In this dream, he partially relives the disappearance of her and the rest of his family about 30 years ago. Most likely, they have been vaporized. Being vaporized means that you are gone from the present and the past. All records of you ever existing are completely vaporized. His rationale is that they died so he can live, as he has this dream of them drowning so that he can rise above. His dream then kind of transforms into this weird visual imagery of a thing called Golden Country, which is kind of just like a non-industrialized plain, and in it is the girl from before, Julia. But instead she throws away her clothes naked and they embrace in a very sexual sort of innuendo almost. Then he wakes up from his dream and has to immediately start working in the 30 to 40s group, which is a mandatory exercise. And throughout the rest of the chapter is essentially him thinking while he is exercising. And in this, his thoughts, we see that apparently a war has been continuously going on for as long as he can remember. But this war changes allies and changes enemies, but the people in the state act like those changes never happened, because technically they didn't, because all the past record, the enemies being the enemies versus allies, have been changed. So the public is basically under complete control by the Act 1, Chapter 4. We get a clear view of Winston's actual job in the Ministry of Truth, the Department of Records, where basically his job is altering the records themselves of the past, making it seem like the party was A, never incorrect about any prediction they ever made, and B, the party was never in the wrong, and C, that the party had always done things in the better interest of the people that are underneath them. We learn of two side characters that don't come into much importance later, but they work with him. One named Tilston and another Ampleforth. Ampleforth's a lady and Tilston a weird man. We also get knowledge of the Great Purge, which happened a lot more frequently in the past in the 50s and 60s, but happens a lot more frequently now, where basically thousands of people at one time all confess to crimes that they committed, most likely they didn't commit, and die publicly and then immediately get vaporized to where nobody ever can prove that they existed. Act 1, Chapter 5. This chapter starts in the cafeteria, where we get this desolate view of what eating in this cafeteria is like for the people who work in these ministries. And here we meet Syme, who works in the research department. And he is currently making the 11th edition of the Newspeak language. Newspeak, as I referenced earlier, is now the new standard language that they're trying to impose. He says that Syme is his friend, but they aren't really friends, they're just comrades. He's kind of just a guy that he knows. And Winston figures that he's going to get vaporized first out of the people that he knows personally, because he's too intelligent. Newspeak, the idea of it is to simplify language as much as possible. And the example they give is that we have the good words good and bad. Bad isn't the exact antithesis of good. It's more ambiguous in its meaning. So why would we need bad when we can have actually mean of the antithesis of good by using the word ungood or ungooder, or a variation of the antithesis of good and the word good with like being is used as an adjective itself. We see Tom Parsons come up later in this scene. Winston has the idea that it's going to be Syme and then him, and then Parsons is never going to get vaporized ever, because Parsons isn't intelligent enough to be a threat, and he follows the party in whatever they say and believe. We also get a clue into Winston's like psychology, and he thinks of the girl Julia as they kind of like glance eyes in this scene. He thinks that she's a member of the thought police, and that she's actually after him, trying to get him to trip up and reveal that he has like a journal so that they can bag him and tag him and probably vaporize him. Act 1, Chapter 6. This chapter starts with Winston writing in his journal about a time where he had sex with a prostitute, and there are deep feelings of resentment of himself, sexual frustration, and like hate and guilt that he feels. And the prostitute that he had sex with was a member of the proles, which are the bottom rung of the hierarchy in the nation-state Oceania. This chapter talks about how promiscuity for members of the party is banned, basically, and you would have sex for the only reason to procreate, and only between those who are married. This leads us into learning about his wife, Catherine, who they were only together for about 15 months, but he's been scarred basically by her repulsion of sex and doing it for the party, as she says, together. And this kind of compounds into his general sexual frustration and anger that he feels towards not only himself but to women as well. They were married 11 years ago, and that's when they parted. So it's been a long time since Winston has actually ever not been like completely alone. Act 1, Chapter 7. This chapter is a lot of Winston writing in his diary, as he's now kind of figuring out his own thoughts on what he wants to write and who he's writing to. He first starts to talk about the proles. They're the regular people that make about 85% of the Oceania population, and he believes them to be the ones who are going to rise above the party and overthrow their rule. He then writes about the past based off of a children's book that he got from the Parsons in their house. And it basically talks about how London used to be run by capitalists, and that they were like super tyrannical, and life was actually worse for the proles than when the party came and saved them all from the capitalists. They even make mention of a like rule called jus prime noctis, which is basically any like employer of you has the right to sleep with your wife. He then details about the Great Purges in the 50s and 60s, and then further the excommunication and execution of three men, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, who were apparently three of the original founders of the actual party themselves, who were at the same power of the Big Brother at one point, but then were forced to lie and confess to crimes that they didn't commit, and then were vaporized, where nobody else ever remembered them except for seemingly Winston himself. Act 1, Chapter 8. This is the last chapter in this act, as the beginning of the end. And this chapter is all about Winston trying to find someone old enough who might remember the past like how he does, who's even older than he is actually, to see if life was exactly like how it's described in these like children's books that are full of propaganda. He first finds and attempts to talk to this old guy at this bar, which just fails utterly. He just drinks, and it seems like he has actually no recollection himself, or he's chosen to forget about it entirely. His feet kind of lead him to the antique shop where he bought the journal in the first place, who is run by a man named Mr. Charrington, who's about 63, they say. They hit it off, and Winston becomes further and further intrigued by the things that are inside Mr. Charrington's shop. They talk about old antiques and two churches in particular, St. Clement's and St. Martin's. Mr. Charrington actually shows Winston a room that he has in his attic that is a room with supposedly no surveillance. There's no telescreens, and there's nothing that will actually record you, so Winston sees this as an idea and keeps this in his head for later. On his way out, Winston actually buys a piece of coral from the India Ocean that has been wrapped in warped sort of glass. So it's like this almost like relic of the past has remained standing since all the great purges of not only information but of people. On his way back, he notices coming along the same street in a completely random district of where the Proles live, the girl that he believes to be in the thought police. And we see very quickly he becomes extremely panicked by this and has like this envision of bashing her head in with a cobblestone. And he seriously contemplates this but decides against it. And when he gets home, he kind of writes about this in his diary, and then he realizes at this point that he's actually writing for O'Brien because he knows that he's a dead man because he's already committed one of the worst acts that you can as a member of the party. So he's writing for somebody else to carry on this like thought of that he actually has. Act 2, the freaking you chapter. Okay. Act 2, Chapter 1 starts with Winston going back to work and not actually having died in the night as he had imagined that the thought police would have killed him in his sleep. He actually sees Julia again on his way to the laboratory, and she falls. And he sees she has like her arm in a sling, and she falls. She's like, oh my gosh. And then he goes over showing some sort of compassion, which, by the way, is probably illegal, probably a thought crime. But he shows compassion, like helps her up, and as she walks away, he notices that she puts something in his hand. And when he opens it, it says, I love you. Extremely confuses Winston and throws every single thought that he had on its head. Where on one hand, he is completely bamboozled, and it even says right here, for the rest of the morning, it was very difficult to work. What was even worse than having to focus his mind on a series of jobs was the need to conceal his agitation from the telescreen. So on one hand, he's completely bamboozled and he kind of starts to believe it, but on the other hand, he thinks this is also a trap by the thought police himself. So he goes again to try and meet up with her to actually see if this is like real or is this just trap. And one of the reasons why he does is because it becomes very apparent that he's very sexually attracted to Julia. And I quote, he even says her youthful white body. He says that he couldn't imagine giving up that in case of his fear. So he tries to get in contact with her and fails a couple times at the cafeteria. And when he finally does, she tells him to meet him in like this very public space so it's less conspicuous. But the whole time he's having such Winston's having such conflicted emotions because the whole time he keeps envisioning actually just murdering her in the cafeteria because he's so fearful of the thought police themselves and he thinks this is just a trap. But the time that they do meet in the crowded street, it basically is just another meeting for them to actually meet for a longer period of time in the woods on like a weekend or whatever. It actually turns out that in this crowded street, like a line of prisoners from Eurasia come and all the crowd gets forced together, which forces them like chest to chest, and they like hold each other's hands secretly in the crowd, and it's like kind of like romantic as they, it's so like bad and dangerous to actually show any sort of sign of love or promiscuity with another person. Act 2, Chapter 2. We did it, ladies and gentlemen. We freaking did it. We have gotten to the chapter where they bone. Yep. It is 100% factual. George Orwell tells us that they have sex. It's super cool, guys. Super not uncomfortable for anybody involved. So basically what happens is she tells him to meet him in the woods. Winston kind of makes his way there after like this fully convoluted plan. They stand apart from each other in this field, and they basically just like kind of confess like their kind of like lustful feelings. And she also asks Winston honestly what he thought of her, and this is what he said. He said he initially wanted to rape and then murder her because he thought she was in the thought police, but because he's so horny for her, he was gonna, that's no good. But she actually laughs at this because Julia is horny. She's horny as all get out. She's horny on Maine, and she wants it. She wants it specifically from actually Winston. So let's get into the moment. Let's get into the song about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all of you. But Winston is so sexually messed up from his entire life that he can't do it. He's like, this is too much, Julia. And Julia's like, but what? So then she understands, and then they get up and they go have like this like romantic little walk through the woods or whatever. And there's like this scene where they're like holding hands and being like all romantic in like the sunlight of the woods, where they know nobody can hear them, and this bird is like singing, but they don't know if it's singing for them or not. And it gets a little hot and spicy. And then they actually just start saying some weird horny stuff that I don't want to repeat. And then they have sex in the grass, essentially, like animals. And then at the end of the chapter, he kind of mentions that he didn't do it because he's fully in love with her or fully lustful for her, actually, either. He said that it was a political act against the party. Wow. Guys, that's just awesome. That's just awesome. So the next couple chapters are actually short ones, and they kind of consist of very similar like themes and things that are actually going on. Act 2, Chapter 3 is all about the blossoming relationship between the two of them. So they meet a lot over the next like weeks and months, as well as the next couple chapters, and they have sex a lot, guys. They're doing it a ton, and then he actually starts to get to know her as well, as they have like many conversations in public because they're not married. They have to like hide and stuff. We learn more about Julia, about how like she's out on the outside, a perfect member of the party. She's like a part of the junior anti-sex club, like league actually. She's running it up in this bitch, but she's a freak, and she breaks a lot of tiny rules that kind of like with her good behavior are covered up, essentially, like getting authentic chocolate and stuff like that, and stuff off the black market. We learned that she's had a lot of sex, and apparently she started when she was 16 with a guy who was 60, so that's super cool. And now she's 26 and hates the stench of women. I love the characterization that George Orwell puts on Julia. She's super awesome. It's emphasized as well that everything that Julia actually talks about comes back to her sexuality. She is raging, guys. Act 2, Chapter 4 starts with Winston being like, you know what, I'm tired of running around all darn place. Why don't we just get our own little private place? And starts to pay for the room that Mr. Charrington has above his antique shop, where they can be completely private. And they have a lot more sex. The other things in this chapter are, we learn of Winston's fear of rats, and a very large prole woman who is near neighbors with Mr. Charrington. And we learn of like the song that she sings, which is one of the war songs. Winston observes her multiple times throughout the next couple of chapters, and he has a lot of thoughts about the nature of all proles, and if they all believe the propaganda that they're being told, and about what they think and do. And it's clear that through Winston's thoughts, after the more that he learns about Julia and the more that they have sex, he's actually falling in love with her. Act 2, Chapter 5, Winston goes back to work, and we finally see the first vaporization happen in front of him. Syme is fully vaporized, exactly as Winston thought. And like vaporization usually works, nobody is able to tell that he's gone. And we also learn now that the relationship between Winston and Julia are now in full swing. They're basically dating, but they can't date because Winston's still married. And they're now talking about ambitions and the thought of like overthrowing the party itself. And they also talk about the philosophy about rebellion and how they each feel about what they're doing in their life, as well as the philosophy of the past and record keeping, as like what Winston's job does. And he makes mention of like the photograph, and there's kind of like this discussion that they both have about like, does it really matter, or does it prove anything? And Winston seems he doesn't seem a lot more intelligent, but he seems a lot more scared than Julia is because of the age gap. It's clear that Winston says of the generational like difference in the education system, as Julia's more like new education system, where it's more like, well, I'm already screwed anyway, so I don't want to do any of this. I'm just going to do what I want to do. And Winston is a lot more focused on like the here and now. Act 2, Chapter 6 is a very short chapter, so I think one of the shortest, where it's just a singular scene, and it's of O'Brien basically admitting to Winston in public in front of a telescreen to come to his house because he knows that they both know that they're against the party, and that O'Brien is actually a member of the Brotherhood. He hands him his apartment like number and stuff, and he's like, come to my apartment later so we can talk. And Winston is like, yeah baby, that's what I'm here for. Act 2, Chapter 7, Winston now fully recalls the childhood event of his family getting vaporized, and he kind of wakes up in this cold sweat sleeping with Julia, retells him basically being a horrible child to the point where they didn't have a lot of food, and it was a very like noticeable thing that he was astonishingly hungry as a child and would steal the food of his like younger siblings, and he knew apparently at that point that he was basically killing them, but he was so selfish as a child that he didn't care. And then there's this whole moment of like the super dramatic thing where he runs away, and as soon as he comes back, his mom and sister are gone. They've been vaporized. And he was thinking previously that it was actually him who like murdered her, but now it's kind of like he thinks that maybe it was his dad, because his dad had actually been taken previously, and that had left his mother apparently spiritless in the way that he was being raised. So his thoughts have changed on that event, actually. The chapter ends with them discussing whether or not it would be worth it to keep seeing each other or to stop, because they both have kind of come to the conclusion that they're probably dead. It doesn't matter what they do at this point. But Winston still makes the argument that maybe if they stopped right now, that there would be another chance of survival if they left or something like that. Act 2, Chapter 8, Winston actually brings Julia to meet O'Brien. And we learn that O'Brien, who's in the inner party, we learn that the inner party actually has a bunch of actual edible food and clothes, and can actually turn off the TV in his room so he can have his own alone time. And then for about 30 minutes, Winston and Julia pledge fully to the Brotherhood. And what they're told is basically being in the Brotherhood means that you're going to be domestic terrorists who will do anything for the Brotherhood to actually hurt the party. No matter how terrible you think it is, the idea of what the Brotherhood wants and what they're trying to achieve, you're going to do it. And that you were going to live in fear for the rest of your life. And then in this kind of confirmation, there's a question of, do you mind being separated? And in that moment, Julia realizes that she's in love with him, and in the same moment, Winston realizes as well, and they said that they will not be separated. O'Brien says that's okay. I'm glad that you were honest with me. And he says the next order of business is to get the book. The book written by Goldstein, Emmanuel Goldstein, and is the teachings of the Brotherhood. O'Brien, we also learn, knows the end of a church hymn that Winston has been trying to figure out for basically like the entire book after he met Mr. Charrington for the first time. And it's interesting to note that he knows this because it indicates that he is old enough, but he is old enough to know of the past and hasn't been brainwashed as much of the past as other party members have, which could be indicative of inner party. Act 2, Chapter 9. This chapter starts with Winston finishing preparations for Hate Week. And Hate Week is basically where they all get around, like pretty much thousands of regular people get around, and they all like chant about hate for the person that they're at war with. And after he finishes these preparations, he goes to the safe haven to read the book. And the parts of the book that he reads before he stops and goes to sleep just reaffirms what he thought and fully articulates what his ideas and thoughts were about the party and how they are able to maintain the hierarchy that they can. And part of it is how it has been remained in power for about 50 years at this point, and will remain in power for the rest of possibly eternity, as the three main nation states, Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia, have remained in this power struggle forever. And who they're at war with and who they're allied with kind of don't make a difference, because nobody's ever going to win this war. And war is only used as a means of production and a means to always have overproduction, be able to satisfy the people of their nations enough. It also talks a ton about philosophy, about what it means to be a ruler and what the difference is about the party being rulers and previous rulers before them. The chapter ends with him falling asleep, knowing the how definitively, but not knowing the why of what the book was for. What was the original purpose? Act 2, Chapter 10, the last chapter of this act. Winston wakes up, and him and Julia like lazily kind of get up like it's a Sunday morning, and they realize, the coffee is cold. We have to go ask Mr. Charrington for some more fuel so we can heat it up and have actual real coffee. And they're just enjoying their private time, and they're looking out the window at this prole lady who has been singing. And Winston, he makes like the mention of like her beauty and it being different than Julia's and stuff like that, and saying how they're dead but the proles are alive, and this whole like philosophical thing. And then bam, axe to the neck, bam, axe to the jugular. It's actually not true, but an entire squadron of thought police immediately crash in through every available opening, and then they are immediately surrounded, like they're both naked, and they're both immediately surrounded by soldiers in black uniforms with truncheons, and they bam, bam, smack him to the ground. And then before they go unconscious, Mr. Charrington comes up in full uniform, not acting like an old man anymore, acting like a sergeant. And it is also revealed that there was a telescreen behind an oil painting that Mr. Charrington and Winston had talked about for a good amount of time, the whole time. And everything they did had been recorded the whole time. And Mr. Charrington was actually part of the Thought Police. Act 3. Despair. Act 3, Chapter 1. We get the full reality of what it means to be in the ministry of love. This is where the torture happens, as every single ministry, like I said previously, is the opposite of what it really means. Ministry of plenty, but they actually starve their citizen. Ministry of love is where they do the torturing. Ministry of peace is where they do war, and Ministry of truth is where they spread lies. Winston now sits in a holding cell where a ton of other criminals and members of the party who have been accused of being against it have been thrown in. Here we see that he isn't fed for like 3 days straight, as people come and go from the holding cell, and he's kind of like the last member. But before that, we see some people, some familiar faces, as Ampleforth and Parsons actually come in earlier, and it's been shown that and Ampleforth has been shown as an enemy of the party because she couldn't find another rhyme with the word rod instead of God. And Parsons is in there because his child actually ratted him out to the Thought Police because apparently he was speaking in his sleep about things against Big Brother. Then we also see the regular proles, people who aren't members of the party, in the jail cell, and it's a lot different reality because they're in there for petty theft, just lighter crimes and stuff. So they're probably going to go to the forced labor camp, which apparently isn't too bad, as it's kind of just like what we would think of jail as now, where there's gangs and a bunch of bad stuff, but it's just mainly ruled by regular people. But the people of the party who are against it are committers of thought crime. So their punishment is much worse and much harsher. And we see that as a man who is described as literally like a Holocaust survivor, skull and bones. He walks in and we see that he has been tortured beyond belief and has been so malnourished that he is essentially almost dying. And then they come in later and they try and get him to go to room 101. And he then betrays everybody that he ever knew. We just get names of random people in his life. And he also just begs to not go back to that room. And we see that if a man who has been through so much torture who is begging to not go back into a specific room as much as he is, it must be extremely terrible. But then he gets beaten over the head and dragged there against his will. At the end of the chapter, Winston now sits there after seeing all of people that he knows and people that he doesn't know and what they've gone through. People have committed thought crime and what's happened to them. Finally, O'Brien walks in. We realize all along it was him. And apparently for the last 7 years, he's been watching Winston. And they have known for every single moment that he has defied the party and are now ready to torture him for it. And so for the next couple chapters, the torture begins. Act 3, Chapter 2. The next couple chapters are again like a cycle like the previous act, but this is not about sex. He gets put through every form of torture, from physical beatings to mental to being personally questioned by O'Brien and being hooked up to a pain machine. I'm serious, it's a pain machine where he clicks a dial and just waves of pain go through him. And it's all an attempt to cure him of his thought crime, to kind of rewire his brain. Winston resists over and over again and says something or the other against the philosophy, and then he gets tortured for it again. This happens for weeks and months, as we learn throughout the next couple chapters. There are a lot of O'Brien and Winston confrontations and discussions of philosophy, of the way that they rule and his problems with it. And then there's a moment where Winston is shown what he looks like in a mirror, and he realizes he looks exactly like the man he saw in the cell previous, like a skeleton, emaciated and malnourished to a point where if he were pushed over, he wouldn't be able to get back up by himself. There's mention of 2 + 2 = 5, which is it's basically the philosophy that they're trying to break into him, that no matter what the party says or what they do, that you must agree with it, no matter the logical fallacy or no matter your opponent with it in your moral beliefs or whatever. Act 3, Chapter 3. More torture. And we learn that O'Brien actually wrote the book that alongside Goldstein. He admits it, that he not only has read it, but wrote it in a contribution with the rest of them. Then there's more torture. And we get to the part where Winston sees himself and he can't even recognize himself. But he mentions to O'Brien that there's one thing they haven't taken from him: betraying Julia. And betraying Julia is interesting in the way that they use it. It's not in saying everything that they did, everything that they said, because he recollects that they've gotten every piece of information that they can out of him beforehand. He hasn't betrayed her because he hasn't stopped loving her. What's most painful about this is he asks O'Brien, and throughout all these torture scenes, if he was betrayed by Julia, and he says on the first day she betrayed him. But in this betrayal of not being able to betray Julia remains the same feelings of himself against the party, as that love kind of keeps the fire and bonfire going inside of his heart. This is also where we were shown that the party at some point or the other had recorded everything he's ever done, even if he thought he was doing it in secret. Has recorded all of his thoughts somehow and has gotten into his brain himself. And that all along they knew. Act 3, Chapter 4. And it's at this point the torture actually stops. It's at this point where if he endured anything else, he would just die. So they give him a regular prison lifestyle. He lives in a cell by himself. He gets 3 meals a day. They gave him fake teeth because all of his teeth fell out. And he's allowed to read and write, essentially. And throughout like this whole chapter, he kind of like gains his physical strength again as he gets food. And there's points in it where he realizes that maybe he could, using Newspeak ideas and philosophy itself, to actually conceal the hate that he has for the party deep inside his heart, while on the outside acting like he believes that 2 + 2 = 5. He's at this for several months trying to do this logical fallacy on himself, but in the end, they know. And he gets sent to Room 101. Act 3, Chapter 5. Room 101 is what you think it is. It's simply a room, dark and void. And in it is your worst nightmare. Whether it's death itself or something, a fate worse than death, it is there. And for Winston, it's rats. And so the scene essentially details this description of rats and O'Brien torturing him with rats. But before the torture officially comes upon him, as they would feast and bite into his skin and start to eat him, he betrays Julia. And it is at this moment he asks for the punishment to go upon her. And at the next sentence, the chapter ends and his imprisonment stops. Act 3, Chapter 6. The very end of the book. We flash forward in time to Winston sitting at Chestnut Cafe, which was a cafe previously known as where the rest of the people who go against the party sit at. Johnson and Aronson and Rutherford and the like. And at this point, Winston is fat, actually, because he's been given a job that pays more than his other job and he has to work less. Yet he's been tortured to the point where it's complete depression for him. And even if he worked for 10 minutes at a time where life was actually good, it pales in comparison to the pain that he feels on his body and in his brain. And in his brain is very noticeable because we see now what they were trying to do: make him into an obedient member of the society, and we see how they think and how they act. The thought of 2 + 2 is equivocally present yet again, and at this point it seems like he's starting to believe it. It being March, he, sitting in the cafe, catches a glimpse of Julia outside. He runs up to her after recognizing her and realizes that, like him, she's gotten what they describe as hard and solid body, where like the pro woman before who was outside their house, she was a very solid and large woman, and now Julia has become the same. And they both realize that the same thing happened to them. They sit on a park bench after some awkward encounter, and they both tell each other how they betrayed each other. Julia admits that she was put through something she could never go through, and they both agree that things will never be the same. But as Julia gets up awkwardly to leave, as she says that she has to catch her train, they both agree that they should see each other again. And then there's some more awkward tension as Winston tries to follow her, but he's so broken at this point that he's lost the spirit of the whole endeavor and goes to sit back down at the cafe. And through everything, from the beginning to the end of this emotional roller coaster that lasts about a year and 3 months, where he was at the start a direct opponent of the party. In the last thought in the last line, we read, he loved Big Brother.